And we're going to go back now, if you will permit us, to Guatemala, back to Latin America now, where we're talking about the former dictator in Guatemala, Efrain Rios Montt. He will face trial once again for genocide, although the trial will be closed to the public due to his medical condition of dementia. And today this evening we're joined by Grahame Russell. He's the director of Rights Action. It's a human rights and community development group. Thanks so much for joining us tonight. For our viewers, I'm just wondering, for those who maybe are not aware of these genocide allegations that have stood against Rios Montt for some time now, if you could give us an overview of what he is exactly accused of.
Well, good evening. And to clarify one point, he was already found guilty of the crime of genocide in May of 2013. And it was an extraordinary legal process that lasted years, and only because of corruption at the highest levels of Guatemala's constitutional court was that very legally sound guilty verdict overturned 10 days later. And so it's not retrying him, it's sort of continuing with the same trial, but having to start over to a certain degree now 2 years later. What happened with the genocide is this was all part of U.S.-backed military regimes operating across Latin America during the worst years of the so-called Cold War. And Guatemala was no exception to that. And in the early 1980s, Guatemala's decades-long state repression spiked and peaked when the government of the presidency of Ronald Reagan began in the United States. And the levels of repression in Guatemala reached genocidal levels in certain Mayan regions of the country. And there was whole-scale massacres of entire villages, and well over 250,000 people were massacred or disappeared during this time. And so it's now years later that the surviving victims and human rights groups with international supporters are still trying to have some measure of justice done for the U.S.-backed genocide.
And so what should we be looking for in this trial now? There are even words that he might not be sentenced, and of course we heard that the trial will be behind closed doors because of his medical condition. Explain to us how this trial might play out.
Well, it's going to be a replay. If it even proceeds to the end, I don't fundamentally know the health conditions of Rios Montt. I wouldn't be surprised if he does have some degree of dementia. I wouldn't be surprised at all if he's faking it. There's too much impunity in Guatemala to get to the bottom of this. But he is an 89-year-old man. But as far as the trial goes, this is just a repetition of what's already happened. And so we already saw what will happen. The Mayan surviving victors of the genocide will present their testimony in court as to what happened. All kinds of documentary evidence will be provided by the lawyers based on documents they've recovered from the U.S. government through Freedom of Information requests and from the Guatemalan military to show that at the time that Rios Montt was the head of the military regime in Guatemala, fully backed by the United States, he planned and carried out massacres in indigenous regions throughout the country. And in the Mayan region, that's one of the regions where the degree and type of massacre that occurred was so egregious and so focused on the indigenous people that it was found to be genocide. So the trial will play itself out, if it even gets that far, the way it already played itself out 5 years ago.
And you know, this comes at a time where we're also following these allegations against the current president, Otto Pérez Molina, for corruption. And you're also talking about sort of deep-seated institutional corruption and institutional problems there in Guatemala. This is not a problem foreign to some of those Central American countries there. Why is this institutional corruption, why has it not been, does it seem like it has not been overcome at all?
I've worked for 25 years in Central America on these types of human rights and poverty-related issues. And I think one of the elephants in the room is the ongoing role of the international community, the quote-unquote international community. So if you take a country like Guatemala, through all the years of the so-called peace process in the 1990s and the so-called transition back to democracy in the 1990s and into the 2000s, there was no fundamental change whatsoever in how this profoundly unjust, profoundly racist, and repressive country operated. And at the very same time, international institutions like the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank and global resource extraction companies, like many Canadian mining companies, for example, were happily doing multi-million-dollar business deals with the very governments in power in Guatemala that had planned and carried out the genocide 20 and 30 years before. And so I think there's a huge amount of responsibility on behalf of certain governments, particularly the governments of the United States and Canada, and certain global economic actors like the development banks and multinational mining companies, because the power and wealth of the regime in power, the corrupt government in power in Guatemala, comes from its ongoing international economic and business relations, economic and political relations, and from its ongoing military support from the United States government.
And so any change there might not only involve the will there in Guatemala, but from abroad and also from the United States. All right, Mr. Grahame Russell, he's the Director of Rights Action, a human rights and community development group. Thanks so much for your analysis this evening.
Thank you.